The man's laughter was a stain on the silence. It was a thick, grunting sound that fouled the air of the diner, already heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and diesel fumes from the interstate. No one looked up. Not the cook scraping grease from the flat top, not the lone trucker nursing a mug in the corner booth, and certainly not the woman behind the counter. She moved with an economy that made her nearly invisible, her hands wiping down the worn formica in clean, precise strokes. She aligned the salt and pepper shakers until their silver caps formed a perfect, gleaming line. Order was a kind of prayer. Silence was its sanctuary. His name was Caleb Rusk, and the 4 men with him were his crew from the drilling site up north. They had stormed into the Blackbird Diner an hour ago, bringing the cold Wyoming wind and a sense of entitlement with them. They were big men, made bigger by their heavy Carhartt jackets and dirt-caked work boots. They treated the space as if they owned it, their voices booming, their demands for steak and eggs echoing off the cracked linoleum floors. They called her Sweetheart and Coffee Girl, their eyes sliding over her as if she were just another fixture, like the faded Coca-Cola sign or the humming pie case. June Holloway did not mind. Invisibility was a skill she had perfected long ago in places where being seen meant being a target. Here, it just meant peace. She was small, with dark hair pulled back in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Her movements were fluid, devoid of wasted energy. She refilled their cups without being asked, her expression a careful blank slate. But underneath the starched white uniform and the quiet demeanor, something else watched. It catalogued the exits. It noted the way Rusk sat with his back to the wall, a position of tactical advantage. It measured the rising aggression in their jokes and the growing carelessness of their gestures. One of the men, a thick-necked roughneck named Dobbs, reached out as she passed and let his fingers graze her hip. "Need another refill over here, Junebug," he slurred, a grin splitting his face. June stepped away. The movement was so smooth it seemed accidental. A simple sidestep to reach for the coffee pot. She did not acknowledge the touch. She did not meet his eyes. But for a fraction of a second her posture shifted. Her weight settled onto the balls of her feet. Her shoulders squared, a subtle alignment of muscle and bone that went unnoticed by everyone except the old trucker in the corner. The trucker's name was Silas. He had been watching her since she started her shift. He had seen it before, that coiled stillness. He had seen it in the jungles of a war fought 50 years ago, in young men who carried the weight of the world in their silence. He saw it now in the slight, unassuming waitress who never, ever had her back to the door. Rusk laughed again, louder this time. He pushed his empty plate away, the ceramic scraping against the tabletop. "This place is dead. You need some life in here, sweetheart. Some real men." He leaned forward, his shadow falling across the counter. The smell of crude oil and cheap whiskey washed over her. "What's a pretty little thing like you doing in a dump like this anyway?" June picked up his plate, her gaze fixed on the smear of ketchup left behind. "I work here." Her voice was soft, yet it carried a strange finality. It was not an invitation for more conversation. It was a statement of fact. A wall. The tone seemed to irritate Rusk, to challenge the dominance he projected so effortlessly. He was a man accustomed to being feared, or at least obeyed. This quiet dismissal was an unfamiliar response. He reached across the counter, his thick fingers closing around her wrist. His grip was not yet violent, but it was heavy with intent. A claim. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice low and hard. The air in the diner grew thin. The cook froze, spatula in hand. Silas set his coffee mug down, the sound a soft click in the tense quiet. June did not pull away. She simply looked down at the hand on her wrist, at the dirt ground deep into his knuckles. Her own hand, the one holding the plate, remained perfectly steady. She felt no fear. Fear was a luxury for situations with uncertain outcomes. This was not one of them. There was only a profound sense of weariness, a deep, aching fatigue that had followed her for 3 years, across 8 states, into a dozen jobs just like this one. It was the exhaustion of a person running from a ghost. Then, it happened. Not with a shout, but a strangled gasp. Dobbs, the man who had touched her, suddenly lurched forward in his seat. His face, ruddy from the cold and alcohol, began to turn a dark, alarming shade of purple. His hands clawed at his throat. A piece of steak, poorly chewed and swallowed in haste, was lodged deep in his airway. Panic erupted. The other men jumped to their feet, shouting his name, their bravado melting into useless confusion. One slapped him on the back, a clumsy, ineffective blow. Rusk released June's wrist, turning to his friend with a look of stunned horror. The world seemed to slow for June. The noise of the men faded to a dull roar. The humming of the fluorescent lights above became the only sound. The waitress, the invisible girl they called Junebug, was gone. In her place stood something else entirely. She moved from behind the counter in a single fluid motion. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. "Out of the way," she commanded. Her voice cut through the chaos. It was not the soft, deferential tone she had used moments before. It was clipped, resonant with an authority that defied her size and station. The men, startled, moved aside. She was behind Dobbs in an instant. Her right hand struck the space between his shoulder blades with a sharp, concussive force. Once. Twice. Nothing. Dobbs's eyes were wide with terror, his body starting to go limp. Without a word, June wrapped her arms around his thick torso from behind. She made a fist with one hand, placing the thumb side against his abdomen, just above the navel. Her other hand grasped the fist. It was a motion of practiced, brutal intimacy. She drove her fist inward and upward with a powerful thrust. Dobbs's body convulsed. A wet, choking sound filled the air, and the piece of meat shot from his mouth, landing on the floor with a soft thud. He collapsed, gasping, sucking in ragged, life-giving breaths. The diner fell into a dead, ringing silence. Rusk and his men stared, first at their friend wheezing on the floor, then at the woman standing over him. She was breathing evenly, her expression calm, almost detached, as if she had just performed a task no more strenuous than clearing a table. She looked down at Dobbs, her eyes performing a clinical sweep, checking his airway, the color of his skin, his level of consciousness. Rusk finally found his voice. "What the hell? How did you do that?" June looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no triumph. There was nothing at all. It was the calm of a clear winter sky, vast and cold and impossibly deep. She did not answer him. She simply turned and walked back behind the counter, picking up a clean rag as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The veil of her anonymity had been torn away, not by a uniform or a tattoo, but by an act of profound and terrifying competence. From the corner booth, Silas finally spoke. His voice was quiet, raspy with age, but it carried across the stunned room with perfect clarity. He was not looking at Rusk or the man on the floor. His gaze was fixed on the collar of June's uniform, on the small, tarnished piece of metal pinned there, so dull it was almost invisible against the white fabric. It was a tiny pair of angel wings, cradling a parachute. "That insignia," Silas said, his voice laced with a reverence that bordered on awe. "I have not seen one of those in a long time. Not up close." The silence that followed Silas's words was different. It was no longer the shocked, empty quiet of a near tragedy averted. This was a silence of weight and meaning. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with the gravity of a truth half revealed. Caleb Rusk, who had built his life on the simple physics of force and intimidation, found himself adrift in a world of symbols he did not understand. He looked from the old trucker to the small pin on the waitress's collar. It was nothing, a piece of cheap metal, barely catching the light. Yet the old man spoke its name as if it were a holy relic. Dobbs was on his feet now, leaning heavily on the counter, his face pale and slick with sweat. The other two roughnecks stood frozen, their earlier swagger gone, replaced by a clumsy, uncertain stillness. They were men of action, lost in a moment that required interpretation. Their eyes darted between June and Silas, searching for cues on how to feel, what to do. The diner had become a courtroom, and they were the unwitting defendants. June did not acknowledge the trucker's words. She continued her work, her movements deliberate, almost meditative. She gathered the dirty dishes, stacking them with a soft clatter that was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. She moved as if encased in a bubble of profound calm, the chaos of the last few minutes already a distant memory. But it was a performance. Inside, a familiar storm was gathering. The cold, precise logic of her training was at war with the raw, desperate need to remain unseen. For 3 years, she had been a ghost, a whisper. Now, a single pin, a single act of instinct, had given her form. It had given her a name she no longer wanted. Rusk took a hesitant step toward the counter. The aggression had been scrubbed from his posture. He held his hands up, palms open, a universal gesture of peace he had not used in years. "Look, miss," he began, his voice rough, uncertain. We're sorry. About before. We were out of line." June placed a stack of plates into the bus tray. She did not look at him. "Your friend needs water. He is dehydrated. It is a contributing factor in choking incidents." Her voice was flat, clinical. She was not offering forgiveness. She was delivering a diagnosis. The disconnect between his apology and her response threw Rusk off balance. He had expected anger, or fear, or perhaps a smug satisfaction. He was prepared for a confrontation he could understand. This detached professionalism was a language he did not speak. It was like arguing with a machine. It was Silas who answered the unspoken question hanging in the air. He pushed himself slowly out of the booth, his old joints protesting. He walked toward the counter, his eyes never leaving the pin on June's collar. "That is a para-rescue indoctrination pin," he said, his voice quiet but firm, directed at Rusk, but meant for the entire room. "They give it to you when you pass selection, before you even start the pipeline. Most men who earn that pin never get to wear the beret." He stopped a few feet from June. He did not try to crowd her, maintaining a respectful distance. "They call them PJs. They are the ones they send when the mission goes to hell. They go where no one else can, to bring back who no one else can reach." He paused, his gaze sweeping over June's slight frame, seeing not a waitress, but the ghost of a warrior. "They are not soldiers who happen to be medics. They are medics who happen to be soldiers of the highest possible caliber. I did not know they ever let women in." "They do not," June said, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were dark, unreadable pools. "Not officially." The admission hung in the air, dense with unspoken meaning. It hinted at a world of shadows and exceptions, of rules bent and broken for reasons of necessity. It spoke of a merit earned in places where one's gender was secondary to one's ability to function under fire. Rusk felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The woman whose wrist he had grabbed, the sweetheart he had tried to intimidate, was something other, something more. He was a man who understood hierarchies of strength. He could see the power in a foreman's fist, in a rig boss's stare. The power this woman possessed was of a different order entirely. It was quiet, it was contained, and it was absolute. He had stood on the edge of a cliff without ever knowing it. His crew, sensing the shift, began to back toward the door. Dobbs, still shaky, stumbled after them. They wanted out. They wanted the familiar cold of the Wyoming night, the reassuring rumble of their truck's engine. They wanted to be anywhere but in the presence of this silent, competent woman and the history she carried on her collar. Rusk lingered. He felt a compelling need to fix what he had broken. It was more than just fear of repercussion. It was a disorienting sense of shame. "We'll pay for the meal," he said, fumbling for his wallet. "And for the trouble." June took the credit card from his hand. Her fingers did not so much as brush his. She ran the payment, her movements swift and impersonal. She placed the card and the receipt on the counter. There was no flicker of emotion in her face. No acknowledgement of his apology or his money. To her, it was simply the end of a transaction. He hesitated, searching for something else to say, for some way to bridge the vast, silent chasm that had opened between them. But there were no words. He had misjudged her so completely, so fundamentally, that an apology felt like an insult. He had seen a servant. He had failed to see the guardian standing watch. He turned and walked out of the diner, the bell above the door marking his exit with a soft, mournful chime. The Blackbird diner was quiet again. Silas remained at the counter, watching as June wiped down the space where Rusk and his men had sat. She moved with the same methodical grace as before, erasing any sign that they had ever been there. But the sanctuary was broken. The peace she had so carefully constructed was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of being known. "You should not wear that," Silas said softly. "Not if you want to be left alone." June's hands stilled. She looked at the reflection of the pin in the polished chrome of the napkin dispenser. A pair of tiny wings, a promise of deliverance. It was the only thing she had left from that other life. A reminder of the person she had been and the price that person had paid. "I know," she whispered. And for the first time that night, the woman who had faced down 4 roughnecks and saved a man's life without breaking a sweat looked profoundly, heartbreakingly tired. The cook, a weary man named Hank, finished cleaning the grill with a final, decisive scrape. He untied his stained apron, his movements slow and deliberate in the heavy silence. As he passed the counter on his way out, he paused. He looked at June, his eyes holding a new and unfamiliar mixture of awe and fear. He had worked beside her for 6 months, trading little more than tired greetings and observations about the weather. He knew her as the girl who was always on time, who never complained, who kept the coffee station cleaner than anyone else. He did not know what to make of the woman who had moved with the lethal grace of a predator to save a man's life. "Night, June," he said, his voice a low murmur. He nodded once, a gesture of respect that felt entirely different from the casual nods of yesterday. Then he was gone, the chime of the bell marking his departure. Now there were only 2. June and the old trucker, Silas, alone in the humming sanctuary of the Blackbird diner. The refrigerators cycled on and off. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a steady, monotonous drone. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled, a lonely sound that made the warmth and light of the diner feel like a fragile outpost against a vast and indifferent darkness. June continued her closing routine. She refilled the napkin dispensers. She consolidated the ketchup bottles, marrying the half-empty ones together. She wiped down the steel surfaces until they gleamed. Each task was a bead on a rosary, a familiar ritual to ward off the chaos that now lapped at the edges of her carefully constructed piece. The work was honest. It was simple. It did not ask questions. Silas did not speak. He sat in his booth, watching her, his coffee cup held in both hands. Each time she passed, she would refill it from the pot, the quiet splash of coffee a form of conversation. It was an offering. He accepted it with a slight dip of his head. They were 2 soldiers from different wars, sharing a silent watch in the dead of night. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that she was wrestling with the sudden, violent intrusion of her past. He knew the feeling of being a ghost in your own life, and the terror that came with being seen for what you truly were. Finally, when the last table was wiped and the last chair was upended, she stood behind the counter, her work done. The diner was clean. It was orderly. But the quiet she had once cherished now felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. "Does the quiet ever get too loud for you?" Silas asked. His voice did not startle her. It seemed to rise naturally from the silence, as if it had been there all along. June's hands, which had been methodically folding a cleaning rag into a perfect square, went still. She did not look at him, but he saw her shoulders tighten by a fraction. The question landed with the precision of a targeted strike. It was a question no civilian would ever think to ask. Civilians thought veterans craved quiet. They did not understand that in the deepest silence, the echoes of the past grew loudest. "The work helps," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The order of it." "It does," Silas agreed. "For a time." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "After I came home, I drove. For 40 years I drove. Thought if I kept moving, I could leave it all behind me on some stretch of forgotten highway. But it is always there, in the rearview mirror." He looked at her then, his gaze direct and kind, stripped of pity. "You cannot outrun the person who sits behind the wheel." June finally lifted her head and met his eyes. She saw no judgment, only a shared, painful understanding. He was not asking for her story. He was telling her he already knew its shape. "Why do you wear it?" he asked, nodding toward the pin. "The pin. If you want to hide, that is a beacon." The question was one she had asked herself 1,000 times. She had no good answer. She had tried not wearing it. For weeks after she had left the service, the pin had sat in the bottom of a cardboard box, buried with her medals and her dress uniform. But its absence felt like a betrayal. It felt like an amputation. It was the only tangible proof that she had existed, that the people she had lost had been real, that the sacrifices made in the dust and the dark had meant something. It was a scar she wore on the outside. "It is a reminder," she said, the words costing her more than Silas would ever know, "that it was real." "Oh, it was real," he said, his voice dropping. "That is the part they never tell you. You will spend the rest of your life trying to convince yourself it was all a bad dream. But your body remembers. Your soul remembers. The world forgets. But we do not get that luxury." He pushed a few crumpled bills onto the table, far more than his coffee was worth. He slid out of the booth and walked to the counter, stopping in front of her. He was just an old man in a worn flannel shirt, his face a roadmap of hard miles and long years. But in his eyes, June saw the reflection of her own exhaustion. "Peace is not the absence of the storm, daughter," he said gently. "It is finding shelter within it. You built a good shelter here, but you have to decide if you are hiding in it or if you are living in it." He placed a hand briefly on the counter near hers, a gesture of solidarity. "You have a good heart. I can see it. Do not let the ghosts chase it into the dark." He turned and left. The bell chimed, and he was swallowed by the night. June stood alone in the center of the silent diner. His words lingered in the air, echoing in the too loud quiet. Hiding or living? She walked to the front door and looked out at the empty highway, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the blackness. For 3 years, that had been her path, always moving, always running. The Blackbird Diner was the longest she had stayed in one place. She had almost allowed herself to believe it was a home. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass of the door, a small, tired woman in a waitress uniform. But behind her eyes, the storm Silas had spoken of was gathering strength. She raised a hand and her fingers brushed against the cool, familiar shape of the pararescue pin. Its sharp edges were a comfort, a penance. It was the anchor that kept her from drifting away entirely, but it was also the weight that threatened to pull her under. With a slow, deliberate motion, her fingers closed around it. Her fingers, nimble and sure, went to the clasp of the pin. The metal was cold against her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the diner. For a fleeting moment, she was resolved. To take it off would be a release, a final severing of the cord that bound her to the past. She could be June Holloway, waitress, Nothing more. No history, no ghosts. Just the quiet, anonymous life she had almost managed to build. Her breath misted the cold glass of the door, blurring her reflection into a soft, featureless shape. A ghost. But her hand stopped. To remove the pin felt like a lie. It was a denial of the blood and the dust, of the sky-splitting roar of the helicopter blades, of the faces of the men she had fought to save. It was the only part of her that was wholly, undeniably true. Silas was right. She could not outrun it. With a sigh that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, she let her hand fall away. The pin remained, a small, defiant anchor on the collar of her uniform. She locked the diner and walked out into the biting wind, her decision made by the simple act of not making one. The next morning, the world had changed. The parking lot of the Blackbird Diner, usually sparse on a Tuesday, was nearly full. Pickups and sedans sat parked at odd angles, a sign of drivers in a hurry. When June pushed through the door, the low hum of conversation did not just quiet. It ceased entirely. Every eye in the room turned to her. The ranchers who had ignored her for months, the families on their way to Yellowstone who had seen her as just another part of the scenery, they all stared. They were not looking at a waitress. They were looking at a story. Marge, the diner's owner, intercepted her before she could reach the counter. Marge was a woman carved from the hard Wyoming landscape, with a pragmatic nature and a deep distrust of anything that disrupted the steady flow of business. "June," she said, her voice low, pulling her toward the kitchen. "What in God's name happened last night? Hank called me at dawn, said you performed a miracle on one of Rusk's boys and stared down the whole damn crew." "A man was choking," June replied, her voice even. "I helped him." "You did more than help him, from what I hear," Marge countered, her sharp eyes searching June's face. "Caleb Rusk and his crew have been a plague on this county for 2 years. They do not just back down. Now folks are saying you are some kind of ex-special forces. Is there going to be trouble?" The question was practical, not personal. Marge was worried about her diner, about shattered windows and vengeful roughnecks. She was not asking about the state of June's soul. "There will not be any trouble," June said, a statement of fact, not hope. She knew men like Rusk. Their pride was a fragile thing. The humiliation of being saved and dismissed by her would be a far more effective deterrent than any threat. The day was a slow, grinding ordeal. The whispers followed her from table to table. A rancher tipped his hat and called her ma'am, his voice full of a clumsy reverence that made her skin crawl. A young couple from California asked if they could take her picture, as if she were a roadside attraction. They saw a hero, a warrior. They saw a myth. They did not see the woman who had to consciously stop her hands from shaking when she poured their coffee. She was trapped between two false identities, the invisible servant she had pretended to be, and the fearless soldier they imagined her to be. Neither was the whole truth. She retreated deeper into her work, her movements becoming even more precise, more mechanical. The order of the tasks was her only defense. Wipe, pour, stack, repeat. She built a wall of routine around herself, brick by silent brick, hoping to keep the world out. Late in the morning, the bell above the door chimed, and the last of the diner's fragile normalcy evaporated. A man in a county sheriff's uniform stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the bright, cold sun. He was in his late 40s, with a calm, weathered face and the observant eyes of a man who missed very little. He took off his Stetson, revealing a head of close-cropped graying hair, and his presence commanded an immediate, deferential quiet. He made his way to the counter, the jingle of his keys a sharp, metallic sound in the suddenly silent room. He did not look at the other patrons. His attention was focused entirely on June. He sat on one of the worn vinyl stools, placing his hat carefully on the counter beside him. "Morning, miss," he said. His voice was calm, a low baritone that carried easily through the room. "Coffee, please. Black." June filled a mug and placed it before him. Her hand was perfectly steady. She had learned long ago to control the outward signs of distress. Inside, her heart beat a hard, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was an official visit, an intrusion she could not dismiss. He took a slow sip, his eyes studying her over the rim of the mug. "Sheriff Brody," he said, by way of introduction. "I make it a point to know what happens in my county. Last night, Caleb Rusk and his crew left this diner in a hurry. Today the whole town is buzzing with stories that sound like they were pulled from a recruitment poster." He set the mug down gently. "I came by to get the real one." The sheriff's request was not loud, but it settled over the diner like a verdict. It was a demand for a narrative, a coherent story to replace the wild rumors that had taken root in the town's imagination. June felt the weight of every stare, the pressure of a community hungry for a hero or a spectacle. She did not intend to give them either. She picked up a damp cloth and began wiping down a clean section of the counter, the simple, repetitive motion of physical anchor in a suddenly treacherous moment. "There is not much of a story, Sheriff," she said, her voice low and even, pitched only for him. "A customer was in respiratory distress. I rendered aid." "The Heimlich maneuver," Brody clarified, his eyes sharp. "Or so I hear." "The abdominal thrust maneuver," she corrected, the technical term coming to her lips automatically. "It was effective. The customer made a full recovery." Her language was sterile, stripped of all drama. It was the language of an after-action report. She was describing a clinical event, not a moment of life or death panic. Sheriff Brody noted the precision. He also noted the evasion. He had been a lawman for 25 years. He knew when a story was being managed. "And Caleb Rusk?" he pressed, leaning forward slightly. "My sources tell me he was discourteous, and that his departure was unusually abrupt for a man who enjoys making an impression." June stopped wiping the counter. She placed the cloth down and finally met his gaze. Her eyes were steady, her expression unreadable. "His business here was concluded," she stated. It was a masterful deflection. It was not a lie, yet it offered nothing. It did not confirm or deny any intimidation. It simply closed the subject, a verbal door shutting firmly in his face. Sheriff Brody sat back, a slow, grudging respect dawning in his eyes. He had expected bluster or fear, denial or exaggeration. This cool, disciplined control was something else entirely. It was the composure of someone who had faced far worse interrogations than a friendly chat over coffee in a Wyoming diner. He let the silence stretch, a common tactic used to make people uncomfortable, to make them talk, just to fill the void. June was perfectly content to let it stand. His gaze drifted from her face down to her collar, and there it stopped. He squinted, his head tilting. "That's an Air Force pin, is it not?" he asked, his tone shifting from professional inquiry to genuine curiosity. "I was Army myself, infantry. Do not recognize that one." June did not reply. A single, almost imperceptible nod was her only answer. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. It confirmed his suspicion that the pin was the key, the Rosetta Stone to understanding the woman in front of him. He did not need to know the specifics. The quiet pride with which she wore it, combined with the chilling competence she had displayed, told him all he needed to know. This was not a person who would ever be a victim. Brody let out a long, slow breath. The investigation was over. A new, more important assessment had begun. "This is a quiet county, Miss Holloway," he said, the statement a carefully worded probe. "We value our peace. We do not have much tolerance for trouble." "Neither do I, Sheriff," June replied. It was the first thing she had said that felt entirely personal, a glimpse of the weary soul behind the disciplined facade. He believed her. He pushed his coffee mug away and stood, the leather of his duty belt creaking. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, crisp business card, placing it on the counter. "Well, it seems you have matters well in hand," he said, his voice returning to its easy, authoritative tone. He then turned his head, his voice rising to address the rest of the diner. "All right, folks, the show is over. Let the woman do her job." The effect was immediate. Patrons who had been shamelessly eavesdropping suddenly became intensely interested in their pancakes. Conversations resumed, albeit at a more subdued level. The collective focus shifted away from June, deflected by the simple power of the law. Brody put on his hat, settling it on his head with a familiar gesture. "My personal cell number is on the back of that card," he said quietly, for her ears only. "Rusk is more prideful than he is smart. His shame might curdle into something stupid. If he or his crew come back, if they so much as slow down on the highway out front, you call me directly. We will handle it." He was offering her protection, but it felt like more than that. It was an acknowledgement, a professional courtesy from one guardian to another. He was not treating her like a fragile veteran or a dangerous vigilante. He was treating her like a competent peer. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. He nodded once. "Welcome to Weston County, Miss Holloway." With that, he turned and walked out, the bell chiming his departure. June looked down at the business card. It was a simple piece of cardstock, bearing the county seal and the sheriff's name. Yet it felt as heavy as a stone in her hand. It was an official document, a tangible piece of evidence that she was no longer invisible. She was on the map. Sheriff Brody had not just taken a statement, he had taken her name and filed it away. She was now a known quantity, a person of interest to the law. The last tattered edges of her anonymity had been clipped away, leaving her fully, irrevocably exposed. In the wake of Sheriff Brody's departure, the diner settled into a new kind of quiet. The overt curiosity and hushed gossip of the morning were gone, shamed into silence by the sheriff's command. What remained was a cautious, watchful respect. The patrons kept their distance. They spoke in softer tones. They looked at June, but they no longer stared. She was no longer a spectacle. She was a landmark, a feature of the local geography that was to be acknowledged and navigated with care. For June, it was not the liberating peace of anonymity, but the sterile quiet of a quarantine. The days that followed fell into a strange and unfamiliar rhythm. Her life, once a study in deliberate obscurity, was now subject to a quiet, persistent scrutiny. An old rancher, a man who had never before offered more than a grunt, began leaving a perfect, gleaming apple on the counter for her every morning. A young mother who passed through on weekends made a point of telling her, "It is good to know there are people like you in the world," her voice full of a sincere admiration that June did not know how to accept. The tips left beside her plates grew larger. They were not payments for service. They were offerings. Each gesture, however kind, was a reminder of her new visibility, another brick in the wall of the identity being built for her by others. Marge, the diner's owner, watched the transformation with a pragmatic eye. Business had never been better. A new type of customer began to appear, veterans from neighboring counties, law enforcement officers on their breaks, all drawn by the spreading story of the quiet waitress at the Blackbird. They would sit at the counter, order coffee, and watch June with a knowing silence. They were not there for the food. They were there on a pilgrimage, paying respects to one of their own. June served them all with the same detached efficiency, her face a mask of professional calm. But inside, she felt the walls of her sanctuary shrinking, the world pressing in from all sides. She began to notice the boy. He was a lanky teenager, maybe 17, with the quiet, inward gaze of someone who spent more time with books than with people. He worked the night shift at the 24-hour gas station across the highway, and he would come in around 4 in the morning for a grilled cheese and a glass of milk. His name was Leo. She had seen him for months, another solitary figure moving through the lonely hours of the night. But now, she saw him with different eyes. Her training had taught her to see the world in details, to read the stories told by a tremor in a hand or a shadow in the corner of an eye. She saw the faint, yellowing bruise on his cheekbone that he tried to hide by keeping his head down. She saw the way he flinched when the diner door opened unexpectedly. Most telling of all, she saw the worn copy of a book on Stoic philosophy tucked into the pocket of his jacket, its cover creased and folded. He was not just looking for escape. He was looking for a strategy, a defense. One night, near the end of her shift, Leo waited until the last of the truckers had paid and left. The diner was empty except for the two of them, bathed in the humming, bone-white glare of the overhead lights. He slid from his usual booth and approached the counter, his movements hesitant, his thin shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He stood before her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, and looked at her with a desperate sincerity. "I saw what you did," he said, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it. "The other night, with those men." June began wiping down the coffee machine, her posture stiffening. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Please," he said, a raw edge of pleading in his voice. "I am not trying to cause trouble. It is just the way you were. You were not scared. You were still. They were yelling, and that man was dying, and you were just still. In control." He took a shaky breath. "I need to know how to do that. How to be like that." June stopped her work. She looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and saw past the nervous energy to the deep, abiding fear in his eyes. It was a fear she recognized. It was the fear of the helpless. "Why?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "There are some guys," he said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Friends of Rusk's crew. Younger guys. They come by the station at night. They know I am alone. They take things. They push me around. I do not want to fight them. I just want them to stop. I want to not be afraid." Her first instinct, the one that had screamed at her for 3 years, was to retreat. This is not your problem. This is not your fight. To help him would be to engage, to connect, to plant a root in the very soil she was determined to be a stranger to. It would be an admission that this place, this town, had a claim on her. But then, another voice rose to meet it. A quieter, older voice that had been forged in the freezing waters of night, jumps and the searing heat of desert extractions. It was the voice that spoke the pararescue creed, the promise she had made not to a flag or a country, but to the idea of humanity itself. "These things I do, that others may live." It had never been about fighting. It had always been about rescue. The boy in front of her was not asking for a warrior. He was asking for a teacher. He was asking for a way to save himself. She looked at the clock on the wall. The red second hand swept in a smooth, silent circle. She thought of Silas's words, hiding or living. Hiding was safe, but living was a choice you had to make, over and over again. "My shift ends in 30 minutes, she said, her voice even and calm. "Meet me out back. We will talk." The words hung in the air, simple and direct. But for June, they were the heaviest thing she had lifted in years. It was a commitment. It was a promise. It was the end of her retreat from the world. The air behind the diner was sharp with the cold of the high plains night. A single, caged bulb cast a sickly yellow light over the gravel lot and the hulking shapes of the dumpsters. The steady drone of the kitchen's ventilation fan was the only sound, a mechanical heartbeat in the darkness. Leo was waiting, his hands shoved into the pockets of his thin jacket, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He looked small and terribly young against the vast, star-dusted sky. June stepped out, letting the heavy steel door swing shut behind her. The sound echoed with a metallic finality. She did not bother with greetings. The time for pleasantries was a luxury of another life. This was a classroom. This was a briefing room. "Tell me everything," she said. Her voice was flat, the tone of a clinician or a field commander. It was a voice that demanded facts, not feelings. Leo, startled by her directness, began to stammer. He spoke of the three boys, their names, the trucks they drove. He described their patterns, how they would arrive at the gas station after midnight, how they would taunt him, how they would help themselves to drinks and snacks, tossing a few crumpled dollars on the counter with a sneer that made the payment an insult. He spoke of the fear, a cold, constant companion on his lonely shifts. June listened. She did not interrupt. Her gaze was fixed on him, but it was an analytical gaze, one that cataloged information and assessed threats. In her mind, the vague shapes of his fear began to resolve into a clear, tactical picture, a recurring threat, predictable patterns, and a target whose own behavior exacerbated the situation. When he finished, a raw, vulnerable silence fell between them. He was expecting sympathy, perhaps an assurance that everything would be all right. June offered neither. "Your problem is not them," she stated, her voice cutting through the cold. "It is you. You carry your fear on the outside. It is a scent, and predators are drawn to it. We are going to change what you project." She stepped forward. "Stand up straight." It was not a request. Leo instinctively straightened his slouching spine. Shoulders back, chin level with the ground. "Now look at me." He lifted his eyes, which had been fixed on the gravel. "No, do not look at my face. Look at the bridge of my nose. It is a neutral target. It conveys confidence without issuing a direct challenge." As she spoke, a fleeting image broke through the surface of her memory. A drill instructor, his face inches from hers, his voice a roar over the sound of pouring rain. "Holloway, fear is a choice. You will choose discipline. You will choose control." The memory was not traumatic. It was data. It was the foundation of a survival skill she had almost forgotten she possessed. "Breathe," she commanded Leo. "From your diaphragm. In for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Your breath is the anchor for your mind. When you are afraid, you will breathe. It is the first and last thing you will control." She had him walk the length of the lot, back and forth on the crunching gravel. She corrected his gait, the swing of his arms, the posture of his head. It was a grueling, repetitive exercise. She was not teaching him how to fight. She was teaching him how to occupy space, how to move through the world as if he belonged in it. She was deprogramming the victim in him, one step at a time. "They speak to you. You answer with a calm, low voice," she instructed. "You give them short, factual answers. You do not engage in their jokes. You do not react to their taunts. You are a gray rock. You are uninteresting. You are not the entertainment they are looking for." After 20 minutes, she stopped him. The boy was breathing steadily now, the tremor in his hands gone. He stood taller. The fear in his eyes had not vanished, but it was banked, like embers brought under control. He looked exhausted, but he also looked alive, awake to a new sense of his own potential. "This week, you have one mission," June said, her tone that of an officer giving orders. "You will practice your breathing. You will practice walking and standing as I have shown you. When they come, your only job is to control yourself. You will not engage. You will not argue. You will observe them, and you will control your breath. That is all." Leo nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and dawning hope. "That is it?" "That is everything," June replied. "Report back to me in 1 week. Same time, same place." He looked as if he wanted to say more, to thank her, but he seemed to understand that she was not a person who dealt in effusive gratitude. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of a student accepting an assignment from a master. Yes, ma'am. June watched him walk away, his steps more measured, his silhouette cutting a straighter line against the distant glow of the highway. He did not look back. She remained in the darkness behind the diner for a long time after he was gone, the cold wind whipping strands of hair across her face. A feeling she could not immediately name bloomed in her chest. It was not happiness, and it was not peace. It was purpose. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of a tool being used for its intended function. For 3 years, she had been a weapon rusting in a box. Tonight, she had been a medic again. She had not healed a body. She had set a bone in a young man's spirit. The ghost of a feeling, one she had thought long dead and buried in the sands of a foreign war, had just stirred to life. A week later, the moon was a silver sliver in the ink-black sky. Leo was waiting in the gravel lot, but he was not the same boy. The frantic, hunted energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. He stood with his shoulders back, his posture reflecting the internal architecture June had begun to build. When she emerged from the diner, he met her gaze directly. "It worked," he said, his voice holding a note of disbelief. "They came by the station twice. The first time my heart was pounding. But I did what you said. I breathed. I stood my ground. I answered their questions and did not give them anything else." A small, triumphant smile touched his lips. "They got bored. After a few minutes, they just left." June gave a single, sharp nod of approval. Fear seeks a reaction. When it finds none, it starves. That was the first lesson. "What is the second?" Leo asked, his eagerness a stark contrast to his previous desperation. Before she could answer, a pair of headlights cut across the darkness, sweeping over them. A large, rusted pickup truck roared into the lot and skidded to a stop, its engine rumbling like a caged animal. The doors flew open, and 3 young men emerged, their silhouettes swaggering with unearned confidence. The leader, a boy named Travis with the broad shoulders and narrow eyes of his mentor, Caleb Rusk, smirked. "Well, look what we have here," Travis sneered, his voice loud in the quiet night. "Little Leo, getting secret lessons from the coffee girl." Leo froze. The old fear, a cold and familiar poison, flooded back into his veins. He felt his shoulders begin to slump, his eyes wanting to drop to the ground. But then, he felt a light, steady pressure on his shoulder. It was June's hand. It was not a gesture of protection. It was a tactical reminder, a physical command. "Breathe, Leo," she said, her voice a low, calm murmur beside his ear. "Anchor yourself." Travis and his friends fanned out, forming a loose, intimidating semicircle. They focused on Leo, ignoring June as if she were a piece of furniture. They taunted him, their words a clumsy mix of insult and threat. But their attacks found no purchase. Leo, grounded by June's presence and her training, held his position. He kept his chin up. He breathed slowly, deliberately. He said nothing. The gray rock held. Frustration began to curdle Travis's bravado. The point of the exercise was to see Leo crumble, and he was refusing to play his part. Angrily, he turned his attention to the source of the problem. "What is your deal, lady?" he spat at June. "You think you are some kind of tough girl? You are just a waitress. This is not your business." June had not moved. Her hand was still on Leo's shoulder. She regarded Travis not as a threat, but as a puzzle. Her expression was one of mild, clinical curiosity. She did not raise her voice. She did not square up for a fight. She simply spoke the truth as she saw it. "He is learning that loud noises do not equal strength," she said, her voice quiet, yet it sliced through the night with the edge of cold steel. "It is a lesson you have yet to master." The words struck Travis with the force of a physical blow. They were not an insult. They were an assessment, a calm and devastating judgment of his character. He was exposed, his posturing revealed as nothing more than the hollow performance it was. He stood there, his mouth half open, with nothing to say. His friends shifted uncomfortably, their own confidence shattered by proxy. The power dynamic of the entire encounter had been irrevocably inverted without a single threat being made. After a moment of charged silence, Travis scoffed, a pathetic attempt to regain control. "Whatever. This is lame anyway." He motioned to his friends. "Let's go." They scrambled back into their truck, a disorganized and graceless retreat. They roared out of the parking lot, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and the lingering shame of their defeat. The silence they left in their wake was profound. Leo was shaking, a mixture of adrenaline and relief coursing through him. I was not even that scared," he said, the realization dawning on him like a sunrise. "Not really." June removed her hand from his shoulder. "Fear is a signal," she said, turning to face him. "It is not your commander. Today, you learned how to take control." He looked at her, his eyes shining with a gratitude so deep it left him speechless. He was no longer a victim seeking a savior. He was a student who had passed his first true test. "Thank you," he finally managed to say. She simply nodded. He understood it was time to go. He walked away with the steady, confident gait of a young man who had faced down his own demons and found them smaller than he had imagined. June stood alone in the gravel lot, the cold Wyoming wind her only companion. She looked at the humble diner, its windows warm and bright against the darkness. It was her post. She looked across the highway at the gas station, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the night. It was the territory she had just secured. Her gaze drifted upward, to the vast, star-filled canvas of the sky. She raised a hand and her fingers brushed the worn metal of the pararescue pin. For 3 years, it had been a relic of a buried life, a source of pain and of pride, a secret she both guarded and resented. But tonight, it felt different. It was not a tombstone for the person she had been. It was a compass for the person she was becoming. Her war was over. The battles were done. But her service, she now understood, had never ended. It had only changed form. Peace was not a place you could run to. It was a structure you had to build, right in the heart of the storm. And here, in the immense, lonely quiet of the American plains, June Holloway was finally ready to stand her watch.